So welcome everybody to the Thrive Co-Living YouTube podcast. Always a mouthful to say that. Um, our website is thrivecolivingcommunities.org, and we're a co-living concept that's on the move. So I want to welcome Bonnie Stith with us today. She is a leadership and cybersecurity coach, and she has a cool background as the former director of the CIA Center for Cyber Intelligence. So she's got a lot to share, some really neat experiences, and obviously a depth of understanding about security and especially cybersecurity. So I'm tickled to have her here. And this marks a change in the focus of our podcast. Pretty much until now, we focused almost exclusively on different aspects of co-living, of our concept, solar energy, um, rainwater capture, just focused on the different segments. And one of the things that has always been in our plan was to focus on programming, and we're still in the early conceptual phase, so we don't have our facility yet. We're in the works with it, but when we do have that, we want to invite interesting people that are doing cool things, have great stories to tell, and to share those stories and to support each other to advance the things that we're passionate about, and to share about those things. There'll be business topics, there'll be political topics, there'll be all sorts of topics. And so Bonnie, her appearance here starts the beginning of that trend. And I welcome you, and I'm really excited to find out more. So thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you for inviting me. And I'm glad to be part of a new concept because I'm a real passionate about innovation. So I think the Thrive community is a really innovative idea, and it's a great way to use the space that's already there and bring people together in meaningful ways. So thanks for what you're doing. This is awesome.
Great. Thank you. So let's start with the present. You're
Sure.
You left the agency a year or so ago and started this practice, or at least I think a year or so ago. So tell me about what you're passionate about now with your coaching, leadership coaching, and how it relates to cyber.
That's a great question. I actually retired about 4 years ago. And so,
Oh, sorry.
but before I left, I was very involved in coaching at the leadership level. I'd gotten certified as a coach, and while foundationally all coaching comes back to the people and their lives, I firmly believe that people deserve good leaders. And while some people might say that leaders are born and leaders are natural, in my experience, actually leaders are developed, and leaders grow through those developing activities, and can always bear to learn more if they stop and take time and assess where they need to grow. I became very involved in helping develop the leaders around me as what I called my give back on my way out. So leading a center was a wonderful it was a wonderful culmination of a great career. But really, if I had to say what's my legacy, it was to show that you can help develop leaders and you can create the space that people deserve to work in. So that's really what drives me right now is working with people to help them be the leaders they can be, particularly because I think people deserve it.
And do you focus on any particular business type, government, private,
Um,
public?
I've worked mostly outside of government since I retired because I think there's a lot of effort inside government to work on leadership, but I think in many respects the private and the nonprofit sector lag behind a little bit because it's not that they don't value the leadership development, it's just that people grow up into those roles and mimic the people that they follow, and sometimes don't stop to assess what were the traits that they liked the most, what were the traits that they liked the least. They just become the people they follow. And in today's world where this workforce, it's really a buyer's market with respect to the people wanting to work for you. They will vote with their feet a lot. If they're not being led well, if they're not being energized, if they're not being engaged, there's a number of other opportunities for them, and they are very, very quick to move. So that whole loyalty about I've been here forever and I'm going to stay here forever, those days are over. People move much more quickly, and there's a much more gig and entrepreneurial quality to today's generation. So they're just not going to stick around. So if you want them to stay, you got to figure out how to engage them, and you have to lead them well. So.
Would you say that government historically has focused more and provided more resources for employees at all levels on training and spent more on training than the private sector or the not-for-profit sector?
I think, well, so in my experience, because I did some work in the resource arena, one of the first things that always gets cut anytime finances or funds get constrained is training. I mean, that just seems to be the easiest one to throw out the door because everybody wants to focus on mission, or product. Sadly, the product starts to dry up because the focus on the people dries up. And training is all about people. It's about, helping them grow to be more. It's about developing the leaders that you want for the future. It's about that future visioning piece that a lot of people forget in the here and now as they're just trying to keep the lights on. And so if you're not investing in your workforce, you're actually not investing in your future. And I think that often gets lost in the mix because a lot of managers and leaders think that training is a luxury. They don't view it as a necessity. And a lot of employees view it as a necessity, not a luxury. And so I always advocated as a way to engage the workforce or to reward people was have cool training opportunities for them to go to. Reward them with time away from the office to go re-energize and build and regrow and strengthen some of their skills, because I found they came back with a different enthusiasm for what they were doing. So I can speak to the agency and the value they put on leadership training, and the value they put on coaching in the organization, because I think we were one of the early adopters of coaching, and the person that brought it in was a friend of mine. And so from the early days, I knew of coaching, and she's a fabulous coach. So I had the pleasure of getting to work with her as my coach for a while, and then decided that it was a role I really wanted to take on myself, because a lot of people think, oh, you give great advice, you'd make a good coach. It's actually not about advice. It's about pulling the wisdom out of the people about all they want to be as they grow up and move forward in that role that they want to take on. So if there's something I think I'm pretty good at, it's actually pulling wisdom out of people as opposed to pumping wisdom into people, because I'm still on my own learning journey. So that's how I
There's
view
a
it.
favorite quote of mine from Illusions by Richard Bach, who wrote Jonathan Livingston Seagull. I'm going to botch it, but he said something like, learning is realizing what we already know. Teaching is helping others realize they know it too. And doing is demonstrating that we know it. We're all learners, teachers, and doers.
Yeah, and it's so many times somebody will say, well, how do you know that? And I'll say, well, actually wisdom comes through experience. So we have a swimming pool, and somebody jumped in to save a little boy who had precipitously jumped in the pool, and she had her phone on her, and so she had this wet phone, and I went in and got a bag of those little those dry sacks that you get in like your shoes and everything else, and said, here, stick your phone in this. And she says, oh, I heard you put it in rice. And I said, well, I'm just going to tell you that the experience has led to the wisdom to know that this is really a better idea. And it's because I jumped in the swimming pool with my phone in my pocket. So so sometimes you got to step back and say, well, what works better? And look for how you can build your own wisdom, but also lend that wisdom to others. But I think that most people are wiser than they give themselves credit for. And when you really start to talk to them and ask them those questions that draw that wisdom out, they're surprised at what they know. They're surprised at what they can do. And sometimes they don't give themselves enough credit for the wisdom they have. Matter of fact, I think
maybe because we tend not to look inside. We look externally.
We tend to go external to look for somebody to, tell me what I need to know, as opposed to giving ourselves credit for what we already know, because we've either seen it happen And so there's that stored memory, or we've lived it. And maybe we were told we did it wrong, but we didn't give ourselves credit for going back and doing it right the next time.
Mm-hmm.
All we know is that we got reinforced for that wrongness. So I found that that's a successful way to view people. The coaching school that I trained through, one of their foundational pieces was that people are naturally creative, resourceful, and whole. And when you start to switch your thinking to viewing the people that you meet in that fashion, naturally creative, resourceful, and whole, imagine how much more credit you give them just for showing up, and how excited you are to get to know what they're bringing into the conversation, because they are naturally creative, resourceful, and whole. So it's a different way to I think approach life.
We're talking about adult learners, and I think this should be for another episode, but think about applying those assumptions and principles to elementary, middle, and high school students, and not just to adult learners. And we've got some ideas around opening up education and creating co-learning and co-working facilities where people are working together. Anyway, another
Yeah,
day.
we should circle back on that, because I've done some reading and I think there's some outstanding ideas on how to do that.
Good.
Absolutely.
I'm sure you're a student of education in general and not just adult. So
Yeah, I think I'm just a student of people. People fascinate me at all ages.
so let's move to the cyber and CIA experience. So my first question for you is, as I was thinking about it, there are different personality types that lead people to choose certain professions. ER doctors, for example. I was a mediator in an earlier life. There's definitely a personality type.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious if you have over the years sort of saved a group of traits of personality types that would be drawn to intelligence and the CIA.
So the thing I would say about the CIA is actually it's a collection of the most interesting types of people you'd ever want to meet. And I think one of the hardest things about leaving the agency was the knowledge that nowhere would I ever be involved with a group of people who were as smart, collectively, just smart, as I think as dedicated to doing the right thing. Because I worked with great patriots, and patriotism is a word that's kind of bandied about a little bit these days. But I will say they were people that firmly believe that while there are a lot of countries out there, what we have is the best. And so and this system is worth really supporting in meaningful ways, and they give their lives for it. So I was working with people who had that level of passion for this place that we call home. And then just the ability to imagine the impossible and how they would go about solving problems. I mean, there was nothing that you couldn't get a group of people together to work through in the most incredibly imaginative and wickedly elegant solutions if you unleash them. I mean, sometimes you had to rein them back a little bit because the ideas would get a little bit, like out there. But I knew I would never be around people that every day made me feel honored to get to be part of them. Because I think a lot of us take for granted sometimes that, many of us who are type A high achievers think that we're always the smartest person in the room. And I can tell you there was never a day that I felt like I was the smartest person in the room. And even leading the center, I was in awe of the talent and the knowledge of the people I worked with, young and old, and how they could run circles around me and their ability to imagine the next, great feat that we could accomplish.
So let me mention some of the obvious ones.
Mm-hmm.
There's got to be adrenaline junkies in the agency, people that love to travel, love different cultures. What were
Mm-hmm.
some of the things that drew you at the beginning, and keep playing with me on this?
So So I was a foreign
Very
language
nice.
major. I grew up in California. My dad was Navy, so we traveled around and we moved different places as a kid. And I started studying foreign languages when I was in junior high school. So I always had this idea that I wanted to go to Europe. So I studied French. Because if you study French, you can go to Europe. Um, I was really blessed between my junior and senior year of high school to get to go on a study trip abroad, and spent the summer traveling around Europe studying. So then my goal became go back. And so my junior year of college, I studied abroad in the south of France. And so my languages were French and Spanish. Well, so what else do you want to do when you like study languages, but like figure out how to live overseas so you can like have a job and shop. I think at 22, most of us have pretty narrow ambition about what we want to do as far as saving the world. It's really about, cool experiences, excuse me, and shopping. So I answered an ad in the school newspaper. There was this little ad in the school newspaper that said, if you're interested in foreign affairs and living abroad and foreign languages and, international politics, apply here. And so I thought, well, that looks like it's right up my alley. And so I did. And less than a year later, I packed up my car and drove to Washington, D.C. to start my career with the CIA. Not really knowing what I was going to be doing at the time, because at the time that I was applying, there really wasn't a lot of information that was out there about what the careers were. Now you can go to the CIA website and there's so much information there about what the careers are, what the opportunities are, what life is like. And you can talk to people. There's just a wealth of information, and there's books beyond belief about what's possible. But in the day, there wasn't that much out there. And so, but all I knew was it was going to be a grand adventure. And I didn't view myself setting off on the career that was going to take me away for the rest of my life. I just thought I was going to go do something cool for a couple of years. And then, like, most 22-year-olds, I was planning about 2 to 3 years in advance at best. And then I'd just go home and, grow up and have a normal life in California. The reality is once I was in, every day was so interesting. And the people I was with were so different than anybody I'd ever been around before, that the years just went fast. And, one day I woke up and I'd been in 10 years. And at that, the 10-year mark is kind of the Fisher cut date point a lot of times about, if I'm going to stay, then I'm going to stay for a career, or if I'm going to leave, now's the time because I got to get out. But I couldn't figure out who would hire me for the skills I had at that point. Mm-hmm. Because, I spoke Spanish and French at that point, and, and who would hire me, because I really didn't know what skills I had. I just knew what I was good at. And so I stayed. And the beauty of the agency is there's so many opportunities to continue to grow your skills. So you're not just stuck doing one thing for 30 years. You can move to other areas and you can do other things. And I took advantage of every opportunity I could get to grow and learn more. And, and it paid off. I wound up running the cyber center, for crying out loud.
So talk a little bit. I bet most lay people that don't have exposure to the agency think that the only thing that you can do within the agency is go and collect intelligence, interrogate people, get intelligence. So can you share some of the different silos? I'm sure that they don't call it that, but the different things that you can do within the CIA.
Imagine a big I would say a big global organization, and all the things it takes to keep that organization moving forward. So from the perspective of, you have the people that are, if you will, the salespeople, right? So you've got people that are working overseas and in other places gathering intelligence. But there's a big organization behind them, that allows them to be able to do that work. So there's the technology piece. I will tell you that so many of the things that we take for granted in everyday life now were developed with the intention of feeding the government need. So, you think of the miniaturization of your phones and your cameras and stuff, look at the history of some of that. It didn't start because somebody thought, wow, this is great, I could sell it to people and they would buy it forever. It started as a need to do a job for the government. So the science and technology piece of the organization, is beyond your wildest imagination. And frankly, the people that work there, I used to like just wish I could like touch them, and some of it would rub off on me, and I would become automatically creative, because what they were doing was so incredibly neat. And it was so far in the future. Think of the most futuristic thing you can ever imagine. And they're talking about it. And somebody is sitting around dreaming how it's going to work. So then you couple that with people that can take disparate pieces of information and turn it into the story that helps you understand what's going on. So the analytic side, I mean, the critical thinking and the ability to find data to support, this story that's being told, or the data that tells the story. They've got the mechanisms and the training to do it beyond anybody's imagination. And again, it tends to be, I think the people that are drawn to that are people that really like digging deep into information, and really piecing it together in meaningful ways. There's the administrative side. So, obviously you're going to have, the finance, plans, the people that do logistics, all of those pieces that run a building, right? So, and then there's a security police force. So it goes from everything you can imagine in a multinational corporation, but they're in support of an intelligence mission. And so, so it's all the bits and pieces that go with that. I would say if you can imagine it, you can be it. There's that many pieces to it. So, so the opportunity to not just stay doing one thing, but to move to other pieces and learn constantly presents itself with the organization, because the goal is to get you there for a career, not to just get you there for a couple of years.
And probably every function that exists in business or the not-for-profit world exists there. Graphic artists, people to put together presentations. Probably everything.
If you've seen the movie Argo, about the disguise master that helped bring the people out of Iran during the the siege of the embassy.
Yeah.
Again, there's that piece of the agency that is, so much of what you see in Hollywood with the disguises and stuff, a lot of those people and a lot of those techniques, originated with, government work. And so, so again, there's room for just about everything you can imagine, in one shape, one shape or other. So they're just looking for people that really are dedicated and committed, and ready to make a difference.
Mm-hmm. I was also thinking about the CIA vis-a-vis the State Department. And I would imagine that there are some similarities between people who work at each agency and some differences. Why would somebody, and I'm sort of directing this, or would like you to direct this to someone that might be thinking about a career in one of those two fields. What would lead somebody, what's the difference, and what would lead somebody to work in state versus CIA?
Well, I think there's a lot of different motivations. Diplomacy is a big piece of U.S. foreign policy. In fact, I would say, diplomacy always comes first. If you can solve it through diplomatic means, why would you go to war? Let's be honest. And so, so again, I think the biggest piece of the agency that, particularly in the, in the overseas arena, is that you really don't talk about it as much. And so, I always said if it made the front page, then it probably wasn't a good deal. So, whereas in the State Department world, you're really out and about and moving very openly in the society in a different way. But that diplomacy piece is so important to U.S. foreign policy. And I think, and I would never denigrate the people that that take that job on, because it's really, really hard. Always, keeping in mind that you represent the government, and whether, and again, whether we like what's going on or not, it's really not material. You still represent that government and that system. We represent democracy, and that is what we are to the rest of the world.
And I would imagine, and you're sort of saying this, that CIA operatives and leaders are conducting diplomacy all the time, and the smart ones probably rely on it more than the other techniques.
Well,
Is
I
that it?
think, I think what goes on is, is what goes on in front of the camera and what goes on behind the camera. And maybe that's the way you would couch it a little bit more
Hmm.
is, there's a world that goes on behind the camera and there's the world that goes on in front of the camera. And so, and both of those have reason and both of them have mission. And so, so I think they're both equally important in many ways.
You know, from I'm a political observer. I'm a student of politics and government. I really enjoy it. Um, but I, it appears to me that there is a cycle with views of the CIA where sometimes you're revered, sometimes you're hated, despised, um, and there's this cycle to it, and it depends on what just happened. Um, you know, Abu Ghraib, lots of things happen and lead
Mhm.
to it, and then there's a pullback, and then there's somebody that comes in that advances. So, what was the assuming that I'm correct, what was the atmosphere and when you first entered the agency, and can you talk about some of the peaks and valleys in how the
Mm.
agency was viewed during your tenure?
Well, I mean, I think it's cyclical, certainly. I mean, I joined during the Central America days. And so, I mean, coming out of Vietnam, going into Central America, I mean, the agency is, they're the first ones in and the last ones out. And I think, perspective tends to be, maybe, in hindsight.
Hmm.
And so, what's allowed under, one leader is not necessarily allowed under another sometimes. So, so there is a sense that, that it's good people doing the right thing, but sometimes the thing changes. And so, again, I spent many years, in the Spanish speaking areas. So there was a lot going on there. And then, things shifted and there was a lot going on there. I think, I think you have to separate the people from the maybe the narrative sometimes.
Hmm.
And so, it's always nice to have a villain, and it's, I always said we were kind of the meat in the sandwich sometimes. So, it was easier to point a finger over there than really focus on the other things that were happening. And sometimes I think it was used as a distraction. So, but, but again, the people I knew and the people I worked with, um, they were all good people. And so, but sometimes the narrative changes, and I
Hmm.
think that's the way I would put it. So, and the leaders that I worked for, I mean, I'm one of those people that says, I ask some of the leaders that I work with now, like to name their top 3 leaders they've ever worked for, and then what were the attributes of those people. And I can tell you, I can name the leaders I worked for, and I can tell you why they were my top 3 leaders, and they all shared very, very similar attributes in
Hmm.
that, they were very people focused. Um, they believe that leaders take the blame and, for failure, and their subordinates take the credit for success. And they stood behind their people 100%, and they led with their hearts. And so I think, that would be, something that I would say. And they were all visionaries. I mean, they knew what the plan was. They knew where we were supposed to be going, how to get there, and, they allowed people to move forward in meaningful ways. So, so I liked that style of leadership.
What were the proudest moments that you had? And I'm talking about macro
Mm.
now. What were the periods, the events, the world events that we were participating in that made you the proudest? And then, of course, I'll ask you the flip side of that as well.
That's really interesting. What, and again, what I know is that, that there was never a call that wasn't answered. I mean, when there was something significant going on, many of us were very much involved in that thing. And so, many of the great things that haven't happened, that people won't know about, there was an agency role in that made me very proud. I would say that certainly, some of the takedowns of terrorists over the years. I mean, in protecting the homeland in significant ways. I think, I mean, again, I know some of those people, and they are heroes. So, but the stuff that goes on behind the camera, is the stuff that you're the proudest of, because people don't know about it, but you do, and it was significant.
I bet it's strange to have knowledge of the truth behind a story where the story is not necessarily being fully told, or I bet I'm projecting, but I would feel a little smug about it, that I know the more of the reality, because there's so much of it that is not seen.
I think that it's not as smug so much as it is proud that there are people that don't need to be seen in order to view themselves as successful. Because in a day and age where there's a lot of information on the internet, and people are constantly putting themselves out there for certain things, and maybe admired for things that that make me scratch my head sometimes. These are people that are making a significant contribution, but they're doing it without expectation of acknowledgement or thanks. They're just doing it because it's the right thing to do, and they believe in what they're doing. And so I think when those people, it makes you really, really proud to be in a room with them, much less part of an organization with them. I mean, it's as I said, I mean, one of the hardest things to acknowledge was that I would never again be in a place where there were that many people that just, I walked around all the time going, gosh, I'm so lucky. So because somehow or other I stumbled and I got into this room. It's like, wow, how did I get this lucky? So
what about when you heard, either on the news or whispered around, these conspiracy theories that are so outrageous? I'll give you one that I think is the most outrageous, is that we knew about the September 11th attacks, and we, for whatever reason, because we loved the Saudis,
yeah.
that we didn't do anything and nobody blew the whistle, that we just let it happen.
Yeah. And I mean, and that's a hard one, because, again, it's that Tuesday morning quarterbacking, right? So, I mean, in a world where there's a lot of information, it's how do you get all the information that tells the whole story in one place at the right time? And so, so it's easy to go looking for it afterwards. But when it's all going on, it's very hard sometimes to get the whole story in one place at one time, so that I think in many respects, I had the good fortune to attend some professional military education with my husband when he was an Air Force officer, when we were in San Antonio, and we were, at that point we were studying, like future thinking on war. And so I don't know how many people were really surprised to find out there were terrorists out there. I think the bigger issue for me was, now that we know, what do we do? That was the bigger issue for me, because, I mean, I don't, those of us of a certain generation can remember exactly what we were doing the morning of 9/11. And, and I remember, calling my husband and saying, are you watching the news? And he said, yeah, I'm watching the news. I said, so they're here. I mean, and that was the way I put it, so they're here.
Say it again.
So they're here.
Uh-huh.
Because that was the reality of it. I mean, all of the signs were pointing to, to the fact that we were going to at some point have to square off, in a significant way with, with the forces that didn't want us to exist as a nation. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's the reality of it. and the non-state actors at that point were becoming, more and more of an issue that we were paying attention to. But to say that people knew about it and they wanted it to happen, boy, I'll tell you what, it's like finding a needle in the haystack. Imagine finding a bunch of needles, in a big field of hay, because that's the way the intelligence business is. Sometimes you get a piece of information, but you have to figure out what that piece of information means. And although all of us are trained on, and going and looking for information, the thing is, a piece of information has got to get you down a path where you start looking for other pieces. 2001 was a different time. 2021 is a different place, because frankly, there's so much data out there now. I would say it's actually even harder, because now you've got all of these databases full of data. How do you know which one to go to get the data you need that's going to get you the answer you need, so that you can, have that early warning capability? The computer revolution and the advance of the cyber world has actually made it harder rather than easier in so many ways. Mm-hmm. So woulda, shoulda, coulda. I think we can all say that a lot about a lot of things in our lives. But to think that somehow or other there was somebody out there that had all the answers and they just didn't say anything.
Yeah, I can't imagine there being a lot of high-level chatter that security experts were seeing and hearing, and they just said, "Oh no, we're just going to ignore that." It's just that a Saudi national entering flight school was probably not going to rise to the level of
again, I mean, it's a different time and place. Mm-hmm. And it's all about what you think is significant in that event. And so, I mean, it's the old indications and warnings that the military talks about. So, I remember, having an admiral ask me one time, like, what I thought was an indication and warning. And, and we were so different in what we viewed as something that would cause us to look a second time at something. But it really comes down to, what causes you to take a second look. And so, and if it's not what you're looking for, think about, I mean, going to the doctor, right? So if you go to a kidney doctor and there's nothing wrong with your kidneys, do you think he's going to check your lungs? And so it's what you're looking for, and, and what you see that dictates what you do next. And so I think humans are humans. And I think this idea that somebody has got all the knowledge in the world and that they deliberately didn't do something is not a stand that I would take. Let's put it that way. And again, because I actually believe that humans are humans. And so, and I know me, I miss stuff all the time. So, in a day and age where there's so much going on, how much do you miss? So, where you go like, shoot, I should have known that. How could you know that? I mean, my grandson came over last night and poked all my needles into my pin cushion. This is the second time he did it. And I said to my husband, like, doggone it, he did it again. But yet, I should have put my pin cushion away before he got here. So actually, who's at fault for this whole thing? Him, because he thinks it's funny to put my pins in my pin cushion, my needles in my pin cushion, or me because I should have just put it away. So, shoulda, woulda, coulda, right?
Let's move. Excuse me. Let's move to cyber security.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
And the most recent public event was this hacking involving Microsoft and
SolarWinds.
Something Winds.
Yeah, SolarWinds. Yeah.
So talk a little bit about that and what we know, what we don't know. I think they were watching it for a while, because you've got to see what they're doing. Tell us what we've learned through this episode.
Well, I think with respect to SolarWinds, we've really learned that we need to pay attention to our supply chain. And so, when you buy a phone, how many hands of this phone go through? I mean, what's in this phone? What are the components in this phone? How do you know that isn't somehow enabled for somebody to like, like get all your data all the time, right? And so there's the things that you open up that expose you to, hackers. And then there's the things that are actually built into your computer that expose you to hackers. And SolarWinds is a case of things that are built in that expose you, as opposed to, the things that you enable necessarily.
Mhm.
Both of those are, problems. And, here's the reality of it. I had a boss one time that, who again was a visionary in many ways. And, we talked about this whole idea of like, what secrets are like now, right? So, when I joined the agency, 100 years ago and dinosaurs still walked the earth, to get to a secret, it was usually on a piece of paper, right? And so, I had to get to the guy who could go into the safe, into the box that could get that piece of paper.
Were they in journals,
Oh, it could
bound
be in
journals?
anything. It could be in anything, right? It could be on a napkin for crying out loud. But
Oh,
but it was locked up someplace, right? Or it was in somebody's head, and they were going to get it, from that person in person. But you think about now, virtually everything is on a computer someplace, or in a
or on
cloud,
the cloud, yeah.
or on a hard drive, or or stored on a phone or someplace in an app. I mean, everything now is digital. And so that's changed the whole dynamic of the business in so many ways. And it's created opportunity for both sides in significant ways, to get to treasure troves, that were inaccessible, years ago, without somebody like carting out boxes of stuff. Now you can bring out everything you want on something else like this, right? So it's amazing, what the difference is now, and what the opportunities for mischief, if you will, right, are now, and how much more you have to pay attention to where you're getting your things and who's manufacturing them. So do you want to trust, that company that was bought out, a couple of times and is now, run by, basically one of these companies that goes and buys out failing, organizations or businesses? Do you want to trust that they're doing the right thing in how they manufacture your goods? And where do all the components in your equipment come from? So there's a shift now to start moving stuff back to the United States, or to places where there's more trust that what's being done there is maybe a little bit more controlled, that there
Hmm.
isn't going to be an opportunity to do something like that. But the reality of it is, that's gonna be really hard to do. And all I could think was like, wow, well done, seriously, well done, well played, because they struck gold.
Um, and then there's a factor there that the amount of data is growing geometrically. That's not the right term, but increasing the rate of growth. So it's also probably harder to find what you're looking for because there's so much of it. If you're a hacker, or if you're a cybersecurity person, there's so much more to see and so much more happening.
Well, I
Um,
mean, so there's I mean, what you call like, like just lucky, right? There's like, wow, that I was really lucky. Or there's the this is what I'm really after. And so, I mean, certainly intellectual property is under attack in ways. I mean, over the last, I would say, 25 years, we've seen intellectual property attacks and theft happen to the extent that we can't even begin to measure what's been lost. Um, and so a lot of the conversations I used to have with people is because they were like, wow, I mean, we'll just make more. And in a world that's very disposable, speed to market actually matters. Because
say
if
that
I
again.
can, speed to market matters. So if somebody steals your plan and they can make it without having to invest the money in the R&D, and even if it's an inferior product, if they get to the market first, because everything's so disposable anyway, what do you lose out on in dollars, in real dollars, if they steal it and they market it first? And you can say, well, mine's better and it's the original, and that one's inferior, and and I mean, and the batteries burn up and cause holes in your pants and might burn your skin. I mean, all of those things, right? But I've already got it. It costs me less, and I'm only going to keep it a year or two anyway. So who cares? And so this speed to market piece really matters, and them stealing it cuts out all of the R&D dollars that they might have to spend. So I mean, there are countries whose whole industries are based on somebody else's stuff that they just manufacture cheaper, and they didn't have to invest anything in the R&D.
Is it mostly the Chinese? That's who we hear the fingers pointed towards, but or is it other smaller Eastern European countries? Is it
Well, I mean,
everybody?
I would say the Chinese we hear a lot about, but there's others out there for sure. I mean, it's just, if you don't, it's kind of like having a cyber program. I mean, you don't have to build it yourself. You can just go buy one. I mean, it's for sale. There's hackers for hire. There's all kinds of things. So criminals are criminals. They'll basically hire out to anybody. It's much more commoditized in I think in significant ways. And there are people that will buy this stuff. So it's an industry. Even in China, it tends to be an industry.
I didn't read that much about this recent revelation, but
Mhm.
it sounded like one of the significances of it was that it was so broad, that there were so many
Mhm.
companies, agencies that were hacked. That
Well,
this thing was really
yeah.
huge. Is that the defining characteristic of this?
Well, it's the one we know. Okay, so I would tell you it's the one we know. Um, Microsoft put out a patch very quickly to disable it. But how often do you patch your system? And so I mean, there's so much that's built onto so many systems that those patches sometimes can take down a whole system. So companies are real careful about when they patch and what they patch, and so even if it's there, what will the patch do to the rest of the workings of your system? And so there's a lot to be weighed in this space. But I, again, it's the one we know right now. I mean, I would never be so naive to think that there aren't more. So,
You mentioned the terms, the discussions, the future of warfare. Is this the future of warfare with
mhm.
uh, putting out utility grids and dams and just
Well,
destroying
I mean,
infrastructure?
so I mean, if you think about it, you actually don't. Here's the thing about this: it isn't that easy, and I think it's doable. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of effort. Um, it's not a matter of a bunch of guys sitting around in pith helmets like hacking at will. I mean, there's a lot more preparation that has to go into this, and so but if I can invest up front and have the access to go ahead and do that, it kind of saves a rocket, right? It saves a bomb. I mean, I don't have to fly a plane overhead with people inside of it, and risk my people. So there is some utility to it. Do I think it will entirely replace war as we know it? No. No.
Well, our
But
war,
I certainly think it's going to be used as a weapon of influence in
Mhm.
significant ways.
And maybe just letting us know or somebody know, I can do this. I can do this tomorrow.
It certainly makes you very, I think, worried about what the possibilities could be. Okay. And there's a lot of messaging that goes on. I mean, if you look at some of the cyber hacks that we know about, I mean, there's very strong messaging. Think about Sony in North Korea.
Hmm.
You know, think about some of the other ones that have occurred. It certainly lets you know what's out there and what they're capable of doing. And so there's very clear messaging. But
When
I don't see it replacing war as we know it.
when I also visual warfare on a more individual level, I think about 18-year-olds who have grown up playing video games and that and I know this goes on anyway, but they're operating drones, uh,
Hmm.
thousands, tens of thousands of miles away, and that's what warfare will look like. There'll be no ground troops, that they'll be all operating drones and missiles.
Yeah. Again, I don't see that. I
Mm,
mean, I see all of these as, as assistance and, and other things that will be used. I don't see them replacing anything. I mean, that's the idea of it's almost like, there's no such thing as a bloodless war, really. But I think that they are ways of amplifying, perhaps. Maybe it's ways to amplify the conflict. But
mhm.
I don't think it will replace what we know of to be, kind of the classic, you know,
Or maybe
warfare.
just diversify, that there'll be more options available.
Certainly. Yeah, certainly. I mean, it certainly has taken, I think about, I don't know how many phone calls you've gotten today from somebody that like said that you ordered something from Amazon. Apparently my phone number is like, come up on their list because I think I've gotten 5 or 6 of them. But in 1986 in a Latin American country, I had a gentleman come up to me with a letter from a Nigerian prince. Okay. That talked about transferring money to his bank account because he'd come into some money. And I mean, it's a story that, that you've seen on the internet. And I mean, this is 1986. Okay. So, I mean, it's just actually made it possible to do more. It's like at a volume you can't believe now. But it's the same old scam. And
Yeah,
it keeps going on because people keep buying it. I mean, there are people who still do it, even all these years later. And this is like, I mean, we're talking 35 years later, for crying out loud. So it has changed the face of it. To some degree, it has not changed it, if that makes sense. There's
yeah.
still, the tried and true methods, that I think we'll utilize. We'll just add these in as like more. So,
I'm stuck in Bolivia and somebody stole my wallet with all my credit cards. Could you please wire me or
yeah. It's really interesting. A year or so ago, well, before the pandemic started, clearly, I was asked to speak at a women's group, and it was an older, church oriented group. I mean, and I think, I was, it was very senior women. Let's put it that way. I mean, it went from about 45 to about 85. So, and so I was talking to them just about basic phone, hygiene, phone security. And so I said, like, the number one thing you could do here is just pin lock your phone. And then I had to say, how many of you even know what I'm talking about here? And they were like, no, we don't know what you're talking about. And I said, okay, so you see the screen where these numbers come up and I have to push in numbers to like open my phone. They were like, yeah. I said, that's what I mean. Just lock your phone. And one lady said, well, if I do that, when I leave my phone at the grocery store, like, how will anybody know to call me to come get my phone? And I said, I think more to the point is, how many of your friends might get a text or a message from you saying that you're in jail and you need bail money? And she was like, oh, I would hate for that to happen. That would be so embarrassing. I was like, if you don't lock your phone, that can happen if you lose your phone.
uh,
And so, I mean, so I had this, this nun who was in her 80s afterwards come over and sit down with me and say, Bonnie, show me how to lock my phone. So it was just, it was just basic stuff like that. So yeah, this whole cybersecurity, it goes from the most, I mean, I think really like just pin lock your phone to, are you patching your system? When you see that thing, it pops up and says, hey, there's a security patch. Do you click yes, install, or do you say, later, and, for the later that never comes? Yeah, times changed. So,
my personal view on personal security is that I assume that there is no security, so that everything I do can be discovered, and I
by
just
somebody.
work. I don't post on Facebook political stuff, um, and I assume that my Apple Watch, if it's not communicating to my insurance company now, that it will, and they'll know exactly, how many steps I'm walking and heart rate and pulse and all that. And I just try to take care of myself and walk my 3 or 4 miles several days a week, uh, and essentially live a transparent, relatively transparent life.
Well, I think you need to decide how much data you want to shed off as you go about your life. And several years ago, I was out in San Francisco, and I was talking to the CEO of a company, and he used the term that I had not heard before, but absolutely was a visual I could understand. And he said, millennials shed data. And, I mean, and I mean, you think about skin cells as you walk down the road, like the stuff that's flying off of you. That for me was so sobering, but so like, I mean, that you talk about something that like impacts you immediately. I was like, I had never thought about it like that, right? Look at all the data you're shedding as you go about your life, I mean, every time you access an app, every time, you're wearing your Apple Watch. I mean, I know people that, that have got Alexa or Google or something in their house, right? You know, I mean, the Internet of Things. I mean, everything you do is somehow or other being collected and stored and analyzed and sold, to somebody who wants to sell you something else. Just decide how much you want out there about you. And and be smart about it. That's all there is to it. I mean, so I've decided, yeah, I mean, I'm going to carry a cell phone. I mean, come on, like really. For me, social media is social media, and politics isn't social. So I mean, if it ever was, it certainly isn't now. So we've got a. I mean, my house is like the no politics zone because it's like, listen, I don't want anybody arguing. I don't want anybody getting ugly. And frankly, I don't want to hear about it.
All right.
So like, let's talk about what the grandchildren are doing. Let's talk about the new restaurants in town. Let's talk about like, when do we think this thing's going to be over? Did you get your shot? Let's talk about those kinds of things. But I do not want to have conversations about politics. And so social media is about your vacations and your grandchildren and, and where you're traveling to, or, or what you're cooking today or something interesting about you. I just don't find your politics all that interesting. So,
Have you had this happen that you had a phone, a person-to-person conversation like with your husband, and you didn't type a Google search, you didn't look anything up on your phone,
yeah.
you start getting ads for that topic you only talked about?
You mean you think your phone is listening to you? Really?
Here's my theory,
Yeah.
that when we ask Siri a question, we ask it to start listening, but we never ask it to stop listening.
So
And
I'll
that,
tell you, I'll tell you a funny story about Siri. Is I don't like Siri, to tell you the truth. I mean, I'm happier typing it in because what I find is, I can go on searches that are much more in depth than Siri could take me. So and I don't want to wait for somebody else to do it. So somehow or other I pressed the button and Siri came up one day and I couldn't get it to go away. And I finally said, Siri, just go away. And this voice says to me, you could be nicer and just say goodbye, Siri. And all I can think is like, I have just been chastised, by a bot, for God's sakes. So, I mean, it was just like, oh, for crying out loud. Yeah. But, I would just say that, never assume that things aren't listening to you. Okay. So, and it's not about somebody else trying to like, somehow or other, get the inside scoop on you. Most of the time it's about them trying to sell you something. And so, it's the race to that percentage of a penny in your wallet that's really driving so much of this.
Sure.
And, and so much of this data is being more and more commoditized, and it's being bought and sold. And it's really about, getting money from you for products. So, so if you don't want it, block it. That's all I would say.
Yeah. So I feel like we need to start wrapping up.
Sure.
Although I could talk with
Yeah, I
you
know. We could go on forever.
all
You're very
day,
interesting. Yeah.
but I'd like to bring you. You mentioned the women's group that you were
Mhm.
talking to, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit. When you joined the agency,
Yeah.
what was the percentage of women employees, or
Yeah.
in not just in leadership, but there? Where was it when you left, and what was it like being a woman in that environment when there were so few there?
Boy, okay, so you really want to start wrapping it up with that question? Really?
Well,
Yeah, come on.
no, I don't
So
mean
yeah,
immediately wrap it
exactly.
up, but I
Yeah,
mean
sure.
head towards that.
So, I joined the agency in the early 80s. And in the late 70s, with the Carter administration, there had been a big layoff, a big riff at the agency, and a reduction in force. And so with the Reagan administration and, in the Casey leadership there was a decision to go ahead and rebuild the agency. Of course, they had Central America going on. So, but they were also looking to bring in more women at the time. So if you've ever read any Malcolm Gladwell about, the tipping point and things like that, timing sometimes can be everything. Just on getting your foot in the door. But the culture of the place, I mean, it was, and it was very male oriented. And so one of the first significant pieces of advice I got was I'd better develop a thick skin, because, I think I'm certainly not alone in this. I tend to take things personally, and walking around there, if you took things personally all the time, you would just be walking around wounded constantly. So there's a certain amount of, behave like a boy to be part of the boy world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, that happens sometimes too. I certainly went through a period where I could certainly swear with the best of them. But nonetheless, I think, as I started to grow up, let's put it in my terms, as I started to grow up, I started to realize that I couldn't win at the boys' game. And I was going to have to play my own game, and I was going to have to be true to myself, and decide what was important to me at different points in my life as I moved forward. There was a class action suit that, by female officers, that was called, in the director of operations back in the early 90s, because, they were able to show that, the women were being essentially moved from, girl position to girl position, around. And so the court did find in favor of the class. And so there was some remediation done at that point. And, and they were under court watch for a while, but the behaviors didn't necessarily go all the way away. What I would say is that the more I grew in my leadership, the more determined I was to not turn the other cheek to some of this stuff, and to pull women in and talk to them about rising up in leadership and raising their hands when they were ready, and not waiting to be asked to take leadership positions. So, I developed a theory that, that we wait to be asked to go on dates. We wait to be asked to dance. We wait to be asked to be married. And then at work, we wait to be asked. And so I used to call, women that I thought were ready for the next level of, of basically challenge and opportunity in a lot, and ask them if they were ready to step up. And if they weren't, no harm, no foul. But what I would do is encourage them, like, at that point that you think you're ready, don't wait to be asked. Tell them you're ready, because I think you can wait until the end of your career and nobody will ask you, because the people that want to move on are out there, angling for the opportunity to move on. So I did, deliberately look for ways to diversify the workforce, my leadership team. We had a plan. And that didn't mean that, that it wasn't, people throw the word meritocracy around, which is a word I don't like very much. In fact, I don't like it at all. I think, it's not changing the standard. It's widening the aperture and asking people who would not necessarily put themselves forward for the job to take a look at it. And what you find is that you get outstanding candidates, and all of a sudden you look around and you realize that you've built the team that you always wanted to be part of. And the results that come out of that team are beyond your wildest expectations, because you've widened the aperture on who gets included.
What about externally? So you've talked about what it was like in early days for a woman in the agency. Internally, what about externally, when you're dealing with sources and you're seeking information and working with people in Latin America and
or anywhere? I didn't find that that my gender was a detractor from that. In fact, I found many times it was an enhancer, because I was paying better attention to them. And so a lot of times, if you think about conversations, I mean, I joke a lot because I'm like, oh, I'm in my feels again today. But the bigger thing for me is it's not just what's being said, it's asking about what's not being said. And sometimes it's just saying, hey, the last time we talked, your wife wasn't feeling well. How's she doing? As opposed to, okay, so let's get down to business here. What's up? I mean, I think that's the piece that maybe made it a little bit different is that, I remembered all that other stuff too. Not just the stuff that I needed them to do for me, but the other stuff that let them know that they mattered to me as a human being. And I think, we as humans all want to believe we matter to somebody, even the worst of the humans still want to believe that you matter to somebody. So, so I did not find gender to be a problem, in that world. The gender thing actually happened, I mean, we're still grappling with this whole, women in the workplace issue, all these years later in the United States. I will say that, that just recently though, I mean, most of the leadership positions at the agency were filled by women. The director, we had our first, female director who is, from Kentucky. And so, and many of the senior roles at the agency were filled by women successfully. So, so there was that movement forward, for sure.
I think I told you that I found out that I was dating a CIA officer, recently
Yeah.
retired, and the way she let me know was that she said that she once took a driving course and learned how to do I think she called it a 180 on the fly, which is flipping in the opposite direction, going full
Yeah.
speed. And she described it as grabbing the steering wheel, yanking it as hard as you can, and as it starts to turn, letting go of the steering wheel, and then you go in the opposite direction. And I thought she had described herself, I think fairly typically, as a
Yeah.
retired foreign service officer.
Yeah.
And I said, let's talk a little bit more about that foreign
Yeah. Why
service.
did you need that exactly? Well, now I will tell you that we took my son, our older son, we took him to a defensive driving course in West Virginia, where they taught him just that kind of stuff. And for him, it was really about learning the limitations of the car. So you can do it for a number of reasons. I would just say, but primarily it's to try to figure out how to get out of a bad situation, for sure. But I will just say to you, once you do that, they know who you are then. Okay. So any doubt about you being anything else at that
Right.
point is gone. Okay. You definitely tipped your hand. So if you're in that place, we're doing that, you have tipped your hand. So, and they will give chase if they can. So there you go. It's kind of like, turning your lights off when you see the police barricade and like, doing a stealthy, U-turn, and then they follow you and they, bust you because,
Right.
clearly you were trying to avoid them. So,
Well, this has been awesome. I really appreciate
Well, thanks for the opportunity,
your
Mark.
generous time and your insights, and it it truly was one of the best of our
Well, thank you. I
podcasts.
mean,
So
and thanks. I mean, you ask great questions. And so, I mean, I appreciate the opportunity to converse. And, I would just say that, all the thoughts and opinions are certainly, mine. Um, but, uh, but I would never discourage a young person from taking a look at the agency as a place to work. I mean, I found it for a place that I never intended to stay. I couldn't imagine working anywhere else. And so, they say that when you're ready to go. And and I looked around and I couldn't imagine another job that would be nearly as exciting or fun as the job that I have been allowed to do. And so I knew it was time to leave because somebody else needed to come in and have that experience of that wonderful place. So that's what I would say.
can we do another episode sometime and talk about education
Absolutely.
at all age ranges?
Sure.
Maybe hear some cool stories about events that we know about and get some whatever you
So
can
what
tell us.
really happened? We call the
Yeah,
Paul
behind
Harvey
the
page
scenes.
too. Yeah, Paul Harvey. Yeah, absolutely. So, okay.
And but before we wrap up, tell us your website for your coaching. Bring us back to
Okay.
the present moment and how people can reach you and what you can help them do.
So I have a new website that's under development and I'm rebranding. It's Apex Coaching, Apex Leadership and cybercoaching.com. So, and my email address right now is bbstith608@gmail.com. But soon to be coming is this new website, and it's Apex Leadership and cybercoaching.com. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing people like come there. So it's going to be pretty amazing. So
Let me double check with you on this because you had talked about it earlier and I had written it down. Is it not Apex Leadership and Cyber.com?
no,
That's what I had written down.
Apex Leadership and cybercoaching.com.
Okay. All right, good.
So
And it's Bonnie Stith,
it's Bonnie Stith,
Stith.
Mm-hmm.
So they can look you up and find out all the dirt in your past by
Yeah,
looking.
and how many grandchildren I have and stuff like that. Absolutely. So in this walk of my life, it's much more focused on really creating the leaders that I think people deserve to have, and helping move forward in those significant ways. Be a good human. So that's kind of my motto these days. Be a good human. So
Great.
thank you again.
And I'll wrap up by reminding people about our website, thrivecolivingcommunities.org. You probably found us on YouTube, but we're also on all the major podcast channels, so you can listen to it by audio and not necessarily on YouTube video. And we have these episodes of our podcast every other week, and we have a podcast alert system. Sounds like the alert
Amber Alert, I
system
know, right?
that
Tornado.
went off every Saturday at
Yeah,
noon.
exactly.
So look us up and keep coming and listening to the podcast and watching us. So
All right.
thanks again, Bonnie,
Thanks, Mark.
and I'll look forward to that next conversation. I'm going to hold you to it.
Absolutely. Yep, I will be here. Okay.
Great. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.
Thanks for joining this episode of the Thrive Co-Living podcast and YouTube broadcast. To discover more about our mission and activities, please visit our website at thrivecolivingcommunities.org. There, you can also learn how you can support our creative vision in co-living communities. We also ask that you subscribe to the Thrive Co-Living Communities YouTube channel and/or the Thrive Co-Living Communities podcast. Thanks again for tuning in. We will be back soon.